The following podcast was produced by Big Head Amusements for KQEK.com. One of the busiest composer-orchestrators working today, Timothy Williams began his career at the BBC when the esteemed network still maintained its own staff of top composers, arrangers, orchestrators, and musicians. He soon traveled to Canada for additional studies, becoming involved with musicals. Since moving to Los Angeles, Williams has orchestrated for Alan Menken, Tyler Bates, and David Sardi, and recently written the film scores for Walking with the Enemy, Red Sky, and the upcoming Debug. Films Williams discusses in this podcast, in addition to his entry into the film music business. Before we get to your time in Toronto, I was looking over your background, and you've got a really interesting series of career steps that you've made. And I wonder if we can maybe start with your work in England, where you worked at the BBC.
Absolutely. I went to university at Queen's University up in Kingston. I was in pre-med and decided that was a horrible career choice for me because I much preferred music. So I moved to London and got a job at the BBC doing orchestration. And it was kind of, it was orchestration, copying, and making the tea, sort of entry level. And it was really a great way to learn the fundamentals of orchestrating. It was back in the time when the BBC had phenomenal on-staff orchestrators. They don't anymore. I think they freelance it now. But it was kind of the golden age of the BBC where they had a few in-house orchestras that needed a lot of new arrangements of pieces that people would be familiar with, but you were able to do these really interesting new arrangements. And I was just mentored by 2 or 3 of the top orchestrators. So for me, it was a great foundation for what was to come.
The history of the BBC is pretty amazing, especially with the group of composers that worked there in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And there seemed to be sort of no, I don't know how you say it, like no class distinction, because you could come from the concert, and yet at the same time they were scoring radio shows, they were doing TV shows, they were also doing stock music as well for their library.
Yeah, it really was an amazing, time. I mean, I wasn't there that far back, but for me it was during the, during the late 80s, early 90s that I was there. But everything was done in-house, and, the tradition was amazing. The level of, just to have those orchestrators looking over your shoulder saying, no, don't do that. Why don't you try this? You voiced this wrong. This is out of, pointing out all the mistakes, but also helping you find better ways of voicing the music. Was amazing. And then, of course, you got to hear it performed. And then a few times I was actually able to sit in and my background was piano. I was originally training to be a concert pianist. They would let me sit in and actually play on a few of the recordings, play the piano. The pianist would graciously step aside and let me play. So it was an incredible period of just learning music and really enjoying it and having that incredible British tradition of music where you cover everything. You would do arrangements of classical music, you would do big band charts, you would do material for Radio 2. It was much more sort of music from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, all the jazz standards. So it was a huge range of material that you were able to work on.
It sounds like a really amazing immersive experience because, like you said, you were exposed to everything. And I guess in order to continue to work there, you had to develop those skills in order to meet those demands.
Yeah, I felt really, it was a really great training ground for me.
And then for the next part of your career, you moved to Toronto, and that's where you did some more studying, and you also did a musical, right?
Yeah, I think it was around in the early 90s. I had always been a big fan of musical theater, loved Bernstein, and wanted to move more into musical theater. And Marlene Smith, the producer of Cats, heard some of the material that I was doing and decided to produce the show, which became Napoleon, which opened in 1994 at the Elgin Theatre. And then it was picked up by one of the top London producers and opened in the West End in 2000. That was, again, quite an incredible experience to have. That was kind of my goal, was to have a show on the West End in London in one of those historic theatres. We were at the Shaftesbury Theatre. I had Jonathan Tunick orchestrate, and also Larry Ashmore, who was Patrick Doyle's orchestrator. He had done Henry V for Patrick Doyle, and he had done Dead Again, and a bunch of those amazing scores. So we had Larry Ashmore and Jonathan Tunick do the orchestrations. So again, it was just a great opportunity to write and work with some phenomenally talented people and sort of continue to learn my craft. And that's the nice thing about music is, you just never stop learning. It keeps evolving and changing, and I never seem to feel like I've ever learned enough.
Was Napoleon one of the key works that allowed you to enter Los Angeles? Because it's a highly competitive town, and I guess it must be difficult for anyone, pretty much, even locally, to enter the business.
My link was the director of Napoleon, got hired by Disney to do Aladdin. It was the first live production of Aladdin. So my first job when I moved to town was orchestrating for Alan Menken. And again, that was quite a surprise, and a pleasant surprise to drop into that. So that was what brought me to Los Angeles. They actually hired me as a composer for a show they did at Euro Disney that was following in the footsteps of George Fenton, had done the score before me. I began to very quickly get hired to do a lot of the live production for Disney. I still do a huge number of the spectacle shows, fireworks, and parades and live shows, and I'm currently working on one for Alan Menken as well. It was a great way to continue with a musical theater background, but move more into larger orchestral orchestration and writing, and that led to me meeting my neighbor Tyler Bates. And the first he was hearing on my side of the fence, I'd be doing these big sort of large orchestral scores, and so he had an orchestral score coming up for Slither, which was James Gunn of Guardians of the Galaxy, and that was the first film that I orchestrated for Tyler, and then the second film I orchestrated for him was 300. And so that sort of began almost like a mentorship of Tyler helping mentor me into really understanding film scoring, which was something that I had wanted to break into.
I've been a huge admirer of Tyler Bates' work since Get Carter, because I always thought that he had a really fresh sound, and the way that he would treat the orchestra and its sounds and integrate it into an electronic realm and somehow find this great marriage between the two, I always thought was just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, again, it was one of those things where I learned how to write for film, how to understand the tone of film, how to do hybrid scores. And as well, we've had a great friendship, and I've been able to really suggest certain instrumentations for different films that haven't been tried before. And that's one of the great things about Tyler, is he gives me a lot of freedom to experiment sometimes. One of the interesting instruments that I brought in was the two-backs for Sucker Punch, which I think has only been used on one other score, but it's a contrabass saxophone, and I put it next to the tubas to add some incredible grit and growl, really, really low, and it just gave so much weight to the brass section. And I think there's only one two-backs in LA, which is owned by an accountant because it's too expensive for a musician to own, and I think there's only one guy in town who actually plays that instrument. So I think that's one of the really exciting things about working in the industry, is you get to try very strange and unusual instruments and approaches. When we did Watchmen, I suggested a completely different setup for the orchestra to make it a little bit more like a rock band. So, we put all the timpani dead center, more like drums, and then we put all the basses. They're normally, on your far right. I suggested, why don't we just put them dead center so that it's kind of centering everything. And then we moved everything. I had two sets of horns, one on the left and one on the right, so that they could kind of play off each other. So again, we were, Warner Brothers with this 90-piece orchestra, and I'm getting to play around and try different things. I said the worst that can happen is it'll sound terrible, and we'll have to take 10 minutes out of the session to move everybody back to where they normally sit. But he was game for trying it, and it's a pretty cool sounding score when you hear it, because you get these left-right big horn sounds playing off each other.
Well, I guess that must be one of the aspects of film scoring that you find so fun, the fact that you get to experiment. And I imagine that the film work and the live work as well and the orchestrating in general, they just sort of play off each other and give you a nice balance.
Yeah, I just finished a score for David Hewlett with a Toronto-based company called Copperheart. It's a film called Debug that comes out later this year, starring Jason Momoa from Game of Thrones. And one of the things that I wanted to try with that, because I've known David Hewlett pretty much all my life, and he foolishly trusted me, was I said I wanted to take orchestra and reverse it. And I had never heard a score where you record the orchestra and then you play it backwards and then layer it with electronics. And the result was really interesting. It's a thriller set in space, and I wanted this otherworldly sound, things that people hadn't necessarily heard before, still with heavy percussion and sort of driving. It's a thriller, so it needed to have some weight to it. But just taking these large textures and reversing them, or marcato strings, fast strings played backwards, was a really interesting sound. So again, I got to play around with that approach and just try to create something that people hadn't heard before, which is always exciting to do.
I'm trying to remember if there might have been like a score from the 1950s by a composer named Albert Glasser, where I think it might have been. Maybe I'm thinking of something called Tokyo File 212 or something. There's the album came with a set of liner notes, and they were extracted from his In the Works autobiography. And I might be wrong on this, but I think I remember a point where he was quite happy, where he got the orchestra to play a particular source cue backwards because he just wanted it to sound odd. And they all thought he was crazy.
I'll have to check it out.
They all thought he was crazy, but he was very, very pleased with the results because it did sound very odd for him.
Yeah, and I think that's always the challenge. I mean, one of the realities of scoring film is ultimately you're there to serve the film, you're there to serve the producers and the directors. So, you do sometimes, you have to be careful that you make sure that at the front and center is the film and the emotion of the film and the characters. You can't lose sight of that. And so it's always that fine balance between trying to create something that sounds fresh and original, but also still serving the film and not getting outside of the film. Mm-hmm. I think that's quite that's often my biggest challenge.
Knowing that you have to be aware of those aspects, does the fact that that the film will be screened in 5.1, do the demands of 5.1 or the quirks of it somehow make it more difficult for you, or is it no different than recording something for, let's say, just an ordinary surround sound?
The 5.1 is actually a phenomenally helpful format. You have your left, center, right in front of you, and then you've got two surrounds, and the 0.1 is the sub. And the new Atmos has even more speakers over you. But the advantage of 5.1 is that you have more space to play with. You're not just channeling all the sound out of a left and a right speaker. So for me, when I hear something in 5.1, you can place things better, and you can get out of the way of dialogue, which is usually down your center channel. So 5.1 is very helpful because you can write knowing that you can keep it up, you're not going to step on dialogue, and you can do different effects. You can have stuff, coming out the bat. One of the most brilliant scores I've ever heard where they've used 5.1 was the Ennio Morricone score for Mission, where he was playing the sort of the classical music versus the ethnic colors, and he had this beautiful classical music up front, and then all the ethnic instruments were placed way at the back. And it was just a brilliant idea. The problem is, when you move to do a soundtrack, of course, you have to squish it down to a stereo. And, sometimes when you do a score and you have instruments that can move around, you can put, if I'm using, say, an ethnic ney or something like that, which is a Middle Eastern woodwind instrument, and I've sort of artistically had it move behind you and things like that. When you come to do the soundtrack, you can't do as much of that, so some of that effect gets lost. So yeah, I'm a big fan of 5.1 because it gives you a lot of space and you can do some interesting things.
In your bio, it also mentions that you've worked with David Sardi.
Yes, I orchestrate a couple of projects for Dave. Yeah, we did the main theme for the Green Hornet, which was the classic theme. It's A Flight of the Bumblebee, but it has the overlay of the Green Hornet on it. So I brought in one of the most amazing LA trumpeters, a guy called Wayne Bergeron, who's just a legend. when I told him we were doing this scene, I think he practiced the Flight of the Bumblebee. He has to play it on the trumpet, and I think he practiced it for like a week, because when he grew up, that was the trumpeter who played that was one of his big idols. And so he came in and he nailed it. I mean, it was insane listening to him play it. I think it's on YouTube. You can probably, it's the main theme that we redid for the Green Hornet and updated it. And Wayne just killed it.
No, I always liked Sardi's sound because I find that it also has got a certain freshness to it.
It does. Yeah, he's a very talented guy in many ways, and it's always fun working with him.
For Red Sky, I get the impression that was a score in which you managed to sort of draw from a lot of the projects that you've worked on, especially in tackling different sounds, because there's action cues, there's tender cues, and then there's also the use of ethnic instruments as well, and some of them are a bit unusual for the score.
Red Sky was a really fun project because whenever you're dealing with an action film, this is set in the U.S., it's set in the Middle East, and it's set in Russia. I wanted to give some separation between the locations, and it gives you an opportunity not only to sort of do a heavy action score, but also to infuse it with those ethnic colors. And I think it's always a fun kind of score to write because you're able to draw from so many different things. At its heart, we had this rock band, and it was just phenomenal drummer, phenomenal guitar players, phenomenal bass player from a sort of a heavy rock background. And then over that, I was able to overlay a full orchestra, phenomenal strings, phenomenal brass. And then I had a good friend of mine who has done percussion for me and Tyler for many years. In fact, he was the percussionist on the God of War score, Brian Kachia. He lives in Australia now, but with the amazing ability with the internet to send him files, he was able to add these really exciting ethnic percussion to the score. And then I was able to, again, sort of bring in some vocalists to add those colors and some ethnic woodwinds as well. It was a great score to write, and obviously a lot of jet fighting action sequences. One of the things that the director Mario Van Peebles wanted, though, was for the emotion of the story never to get lost. And I began playing him a few of the action cues the first time we met. And he turned to me and he said, well, it's clear you can write the action stuff. He said, but what about the tender moments? It was interesting because he was really wanted those emotional beats to play. And Mario's great fun to work with. He's got a great ear.
You've orchestrated for Menken, for Tyler Bates, for David Sardi, and then there's your own work. How do you maintain the distinction in each of the projects? Because there's 4 different styles that can be applied there, but you've obviously got to maintain a certain fidelity to yourself as well as the other composers that you're working for. Yeah,
that's a great question. One of the things that I like to do is, for me, when I write music, I always see it as sort of, I don't know if it's left brain, right brain. When you're composing, you're writing to picture, you're inspired. You deal with all the pressure, though, of having to really try to write something great for film. What I like about orchestration is you're sort of a step removed from that. And so it becomes much more of an intellectual exercise. It doesn't need to be so aggressively creative, if that's the right word. It's more mathematical. You're sitting there making sure everything is really balanced well within the orchestra, that the lines you want to hear are coming out, that the colors are good. And so for me, it's nice to switch between the two. It's great when I have those, that desire to write, have a project where I can really be creative. But I also love collaboration, and it's really fun when I work with those different composers. I mean, they have a very clear idea of the sound they want, and they have a very clear idea of what the project should be. And so I'm really there in a support role to help them achieve their sound, their vision for what the score should sound like. And obviously it gets very technical at a certain point. Disney needs to sound like Disney. You know, Tyler has a sound, Dave Sardy has a sound, and you need to adjust and make sure that that's not compromised.
For Red Sky, the score itself runs about a half hour, and I wonder if the length of the score itself is a bit of a challenge in pitching it to a record label, because I know that it can be challenging to just even get a soundtrack released, and I wonder if length sometimes is something that can also make it more difficult.
I'm very grateful to Lakeshore Records because they, you know, I have two soundtracks. One is for Walking with the Enemy, which was a Holocaust film starring Ben Kingsley, that I recently finished, and we recorded that at Abbey Road, and that looks like it's going to be an exciting soundtrack release. Red Sky was sort of, you know, the other thing that I played for the record company, and they really liked the sound of it. I'm a little ADD, so I get bored very easily, so when I edited the cues, I just wanted them to be sort of really clear and punchy and concise, and there was a lot of material that I ended up leaving off because one of the things about when you're scoring a film is, you know, you don't want to steal focus from the film. You don't want to steal focus from the dialogue. And sometimes the role of film score music is to support. And I think on a soundtrack, certainly in my opinion, that music can sound very dull. It's serving a purpose. It's helping the film move forward, but it's staying out of the way. And I guess I'm a pretty harsh critic of my own stuff. So I was like, yeah, no, leave that off. I just wanted to try to distill it down to what I felt was the best material that I could find from the score.
And then my last question is just, will Debug get a soundtrack release?
I'm hopeful. There's certainly discussions at the moment about it, and I'm just in the process right now of going through and finding which cues would be interesting for a soundtrack. Ultimately, for me, I want the soundtrack CDs to be an experience of their own. I don't just want to take cues and throw them onto an album. I want it to be a separate experience from the film where you can sit down and enjoy it as a CD from beginning to end. So normally what I'll do is I'll go through and edit and typically remix it, you know, because it's in 5/1, and try to make it interesting in stereo. So that takes a little bit of time, but I'm hopeful there'll be a Debug release.
The soundtrack to Williams's Red Sky is currently available as a digital download from Lakeshore Records. For reviews, further interviews, and additional information, please visit KQEK.com. For podcasting services, including editing and mixing, please visit the Multimedia Skills section at mondomark.com for further information plus media samples. This program is copyrighted 2014 by Mark R. Hassan.